What if the Chachnama was never meant to be a history book at all? What if, hidden in its stories of kings and conquests, lies a blueprint for ethical governance, one shaped by centuries of political wisdom from both Sind and the broader Islamic world? Welcome back to a book of conquest today. We read not for events, but for ideas. We're taking a deep dive today into the Chachnama. Now, this is a text that's usually read as the history, the definitive account of the 8th century Muslim conquest of Sind.
Right, the standard story.
But the source material we're exploring, and we're drawing quite a bit here on Manan Ahmed Asif's work, it asks us to look again. It really challenges those conventional interpretations.
Challenges them pretty directly.
So that's really the mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To move past just reading the Chachnama for, well, what happened?
Exactly. And instead, try to understand the sophisticated political vision that the source argues is really at its heart. And we can pull out those key insights about governance, sure, but also identity, and even, what these historical texts are.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's tackle that first big idea. How has the Chachnama traditionally been seen? What's the standard take?
Well, for a long time, the standard view is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's seen as basically a translation.
From Arabic.
From an older Arabic manuscript, yeah. And it's read as a direct account of the 8th century Muslim conquest of Sind, led by Muhammad bin Qasim. It's kind of been the go-to text if you want to understand the arrival of Islam in the region as primarily a military event.
Right. Conquest, first and foremost.
That's the usual frame.
But the source material for this deep dive, it just flips that completely on its head. What's the core argument challenging that view?
The central claim is, well, that this standard interpretation basically misses the whole point.
Okay.
The source argues that Chachnama was originally written in Persian, not just a translation from Arabic. And maybe more importantly, it's fundamentally a work of subtle, quite sophisticated political theory, not just a narrative of imperial aggression.
That's a really huge shift in perspective. Why does seeing it that way matter so much, especially maybe for how we understand the region today?
Oh, it matters a lot. Because as the source argues, the traditional reading often ends up reinforcing these rigid divisions, like sharp lines drawn between Muslim and Hindu.
Divides that can be problematic.
Exactly. And these sometimes define modern South Asian politics. So looking at the Chachnama as political theory offers a much more complex origin story for Islam's presence in the region, one that's rooted in, negotiation, local context, not just foreign conquest. It's a different way to think about it.
Okay, so if it's not mainly about the 8th century, then when and where was this political theory actually written? Let's set the scene a bit.
Right. We need to transport ourselves to the early 13th century.
13th century, okay.
Specifically, the city of Uk in Sind. That's the time and place where Ali Kufi, the author we know, was actually writing.
And what was going on in Uk back then? What was that world like?
Oh, it was incredibly dynamic and, frankly, pretty unstable. This was a period of really intense power struggles.
Between whom?
Between the Ghulams. These were the powerful slave lieutenants of the Ghurid ruler, Muizzuddin Muhammad bin Sam Gur, who had recently died. So you have these major players like Shams al-Din Iltutmish, based in Delhi, and Nasiruddin Kabacha, who was right there in Ush and Multan.
So rivals vying for power.
Big time. And their armies were fascinating mixes.
Right.
Indic troops, Turkic troops, Iranian soldiers, all constantly fighting for control of these crucial city forts.
And wasn't the pressure from further west, too, something bigger looming?
Absolutely. You hit it. This internal fighting, this struggle for succession, was happening precisely as the Mongol armies under Genghis Khan were sweeping through Central Asia.
Wow, so external threat meets internal chaos.
Exactly, and that instability just pushed refugees, soldiers, intellectuals further eastward into Sind and Punjab. It added a whole other layer of complexity and, frankly, anxiety to the political situation.
So these rulers, Iltutmish, Kabacha, they weren't just fighting battles. They must have been trying to build legitimacy, right? Solidify their rule in this really messy environment. How did they do that, beyond just having armies?
That's a great point. They couldn't rely just on military power. They actively courted intellectuals, scholars, poets, mystics, and from all sorts of backgrounds, Indic, Turkic, Iranian.
Trying to build a court.
Yes, building a prestigious court. They commissioned texts, histories, poetry, things that would support their claims to rule. They also sought alliances with really influential religious figures, especially Sufi sheikhs. Think of Sheikh Ba'odin Zakaria in Multan. He was a major figure Kabacha tried to align with. There was a very conscious effort to build, cultural and religious capital to back up their political power.
And the source we're looking at argues that Chachnama is a direct product of the specific, turbulent 13th century world, not just some echo of the 8th.
Absolutely. That's the core argument.
Okay.
The Chachnama was written as a direct response to the political and military realities of the early 13th century in Sind.
So it's speaking to its present moment.
Precisely. It's not just recounting the 8th century for history's sake. It's using that historical setting, that narrative frame, to offer a theory of politics, an ethics of statecraft that was relevant then and there to the rulers in the elite world of Ali Kufi's time. The source really emphasizes that the text is deeply immersed in its immediate political, its spatial, and its textual context.
Okay, this leads to one of the most maybe surprising insights from the source material,
Yeah.
the challenge to the Chachnama's own claim that it's a translation from Arabic. Why is the source skeptical about that? Why not just take Kufi at his word?
It's a great question. The source argues that just taking Kufi's claim of translation at face value means you miss the social and political game being played at the time.
Okay.
See, by the 13th century, Persian wasn't just a language. It had become the language of state, of elite culture, across much of North India, certainly in cities like Ush, Multan, Lahore. Translating things into Persian was happening all the time. But claiming your text originated in Arabic, that had a very specific function.
A function tied to what the source calls a prestige economy. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, exactly. Think about this competitive courtly world in the 13th century. Claiming a connection to Arab origins, whether it was claiming actual biological descent from early figures in Islam, or claiming your text came from the Arabic heartlands, was a powerful move.
How so?
It was a way to assert authority, legitimacy. It wasn't necessarily about proving literal historical fact in the way we might think today. It was about establishing your right, your prestige to produce knowledge, to interpret events, and crucially, to advise the ruling elite through your writing. It gave your work weight.
Interesting. Can you give us some examples? How did other writers around that time use this connection to Arab origins for prestige?
Sure. There's some good examples in the source. Someone like Fakhar Mudaber. He was writing a genealogy, basically a family tree, of Turkic rulers. But he explicitly traces his own lineage back to the second caliph, Abu Bakr. Right. That's not just incidental family history. He's linking his personal standing, his prestige, directly to the legitimacy of the rulers he's writing about.
Okay, I see.
Or take Muhammad Afi.
Yeah.
He was active around the same time. He translated, or maybe it's better to say he reinterpreted or transcreated Arabic literary works into Persian. He framed this as, making this great heritage available to a learned Persian-speaking audience. But he was also very clear that his own work, his Persian version, was something new and valuable in itself. And get this, he even dedicated one of his major texts, the Lubab al-Bab, to a patron who was also claiming Arab lineage. So you see these claims reinforcing each other, building up layers of cultural prestige and political connection.
Right, multiple levels.
Exactly. Even Minhaj Siraj Jujani, the famous author of the Tabaqat-i Nasiri, who was also connected to the court in Kuki, just like Kufi, he really emphasizes his family's deep ties to the prophetic past and the Abbasid caliphs. Again, it's about using that textual genealogy to shore up his own authority as a historian and advisor.
So, with all that context, when we look again at Ali Kufi's preface in the Chachnama, his whole story about finding an old Arabic history in Uruk and translating it into Persian, it starts to look different.
It really does, especially the language he uses. He has these elaborate metaphors, like the Arabic text being a beautiful bride, hidden away, now revealed to the learned Persianate betrothed. That's very courtly, very deliberate language.
It sounds very performative, almost.
It does. And Kufi is also incredibly clear about the text's purpose. He doesn't just say, here's a history. He says its aim is pedagogical. It's meant to teach, to guide.
Guide whom?
Rulers. He calls them slaves of the prophet's world, and says the text is meant to help keep their sultanate strong. He explicitly states it provides jewels of wisdom and pearls of advice, including, and this is key, methods for the running of the affairs of government.
Ah, okay. So the core insight here from the source is that Kufi's claim of translation, his invocation of Arabic origins, it wasn't really about trying to be historically faithful to some lost 8th century document.
Probably not, no.
It was more of a strategic move within that 13th century prestige economy.
Exactly. The source argues it was a deliberate strategy, a way to give his Persian work immense authority, to frame it not just as a story, but as a text packed with crucial moral and ethical guidance. Guidance fit for the rulers of his time, the early 13th century. It positioned the Chachnama as serious political counsel, something worthy of public reflection and vital for advising the leadership during a period of intense upheaval.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's move on to another major challenge the source presents. This is the idea that the Chachnama isn't simply a conquest narrative, a fathnama or future text.
Right. That's the other big label the source argues we shouldn't just accept at face value.
So what are typical Islamic conquest narratives like? What defines that genre?
Well, these future texts, they generally grew out of accounts of the early Islamic military campaigns, the expansion out of Arabia. They often focused on demonstrating, well, Islam's inevitable triumph. They served to bolster the political authority of the conquerors, the caliphs, the rulers, and they tended to have a specific structure.
Like what?
Often they relied on detailed chains of transmission, isnads, to establish authenticity. They focused heavily on the events of the campaigns, logistics, battles, acts of valor. They were usually organized chronologically or maybe by region conquered. A classic example might be Belaturi's Fucha al-Buldan, which described these frontier regions often as, difficult, volatile places being brought into the fold.
Okay, so that's the standard model. How does the Chachnama, according to this source, diverge from that? How is it different?
In several really significant ways. First, structurally. The Chachnama often uses these quite vague attributions, like the wise men of Sind say, or Brahmins report that. It doesn't usually have the meticulous chains of transmission you'd expect in classical Arabic historiography.
Interesting. What else?
More fundamentally, think about where it starts. It doesn't begin with the arrival of Muhammad bin Qasim and the Muslim armies.
Right, you mentioned this earlier. It starts with Chach.
Exactly. It starts with the story of the Brahmin ruler Chach, his rise to power, and his kingdom in Sind. And the focus throughout is heavily on themes like leadership, legitimacy, the importance of good counsel, the dangers of treachery. These are themes absolutely central to political theory, to mirrors for princes, not just straight military history.
And you mentioned this deliberate mirroring between Chach and Muhammad bin Qasim.
Yes, that's crucial. The source argues the text consciously parallels Chach's campaigns and actions with those of Muhammad bin Qasim, suggesting a continuity or a shared understanding of kingship.
Okay.
And perhaps the most striking departure, the source argues, is that the Chachnama introduces a notion that was pretty radical for Muslim historiography at the time.
Which is?
The idea of limited kingship. The idea that rule isn't just about boundless expansion, but involves negotiation, recognizing limits, respecting existing structures.
Wow, okay. That sounds fascinating. Can you give us some specific examples from the text that really illustrate this idea of limits and maybe that mirroring you talked about? How does it play out?
Sure. Let's look right at the beginning, the description of Sind itself under Chach. The text portrays the city of Error and Chach's kingdom not as some, chaotic, empty land ripe for conquest, but as this grand, ordered, lively place. It has established boundaries, culture, administration. That immediately sets a different tone than conquest narratives that often paint the before picture negatively.
Okay, so it establishes Sind as a legitimate polity before the conquest.
Precisely. Then consider Chach's actions after he consolidates his rule. This is really telling. The text describes him marching to the very edges of his kingdom. And near Kashmir, he plants two specific trees, a sapodar and a sanabar.
Trees as border markers.
Yes, and he explicitly states that this marks the limit of his kingship, a boundary he declares he will not cross. He even waits there for the trees to grow and intertwine, which the text presents as a gesture of patience, of recognizing limits, respecting the territory of another ruler beyond his border.
That's a powerful image. Does he do this elsewhere?
He does. He plants date palm trees at the border with Makran and Kiraman down south. And here's a really interesting detail. The text makes a point of telling the 13th century reader that this limit, marked by Chach's trees, remains there to this day.
Ah, so it explicitly connects the 8th century action to the 13th century present of the author and audience?
Exactly. It collapses that time, making Chach's actions relevant now.
So the crucial question then is, how does Muhammad bin Qasim's campaign, as depicted in the Chachnama, interact with these limits established by the Brahmin king Chach? This is where the source finds the real political message, right? Against the simple conquest idea.
Absolutely. This is where it gets really interesting and pushes back hard against just reading it as a fathnama. The Chachnama describes Muhammad bin Qasim reaching that northern limit of Kashmir, the one marked by Chach intertwining trees.
And what does he do? Does he push past it?
No. That's the point. Instead of conquering beyond it, the text says he renews his commitment to that very limit. He even plants a Muslim standard right there at that spot. It's as if he's acknowledging, adopting, even validating Chach's vision of a geographically bounded, limited polity.
Even though Chach was a non-Muslim ruler.
Exactly. He's inheriting and respecting a pre-existing political geography and its associated ethics of limitation.
So the core insight here is that the Chachnama might be using the narrative form of a conquest story, sure, but it's actually delivering a much more nuanced political theory message. A message about restrained power, about respecting limits, about negotiation, and maybe even inheriting traditions of governance that existed before Muslim rule arrived.
Precisely. That's the argument. It's not a straightforward story of inevitable Islamic domination and expansion. It's a text wrestling with the messy, complex idea of how you actually form and govern a legitimate polity. And it suggests that process involves dialogue, respecting established boundaries, and integrating existing traditions, even those originating from rulers of a different faith. It's far more complex than just conquest.
This new perspective, seeing the Chachnama as 13th century political theory focused on limits and dialogue, it also challenges how Sind itself was viewed later, particularly during the colonial era, right? This idea of Sind as an empty space.
That's absolutely right. That colonial interpretation is another layer the source seeks to correct. Colonial historians and archaeologists, people like Henry Cousins, often took the Chachnama, misreading it as purely an 8th century conquest history focused only on destruction, and used it to argue something quite specific. They argued that the Muslim conquest effectively wiped out Hindu civilization in Sind, and that there was no significant Arab presence or lasting cultural impact after that initial 8th century invasion. Their narrative basically depicted Sind as an empty wasteland, devoid of history or culture, until much later Muslim dynasties like the Mughals arrived.
A narrative of rupture and emptiness.
Exactly. A convenient narrative perhaps for colonial rule.
But the source material we're discussing argues that the Chachnama itself, when read carefully in its 13th century context, along with a lot of other evidence, paints a completely different picture of Sind.
Completely different, yes. The source contends that both the Chachnama read as this text about governance in a complex world, and numerous other contemporary texts and archaeological evidence reveal a really vibrant, interconnected geography in the 13th century, and indeed long before that.
So Sind wasn't empty.
Far from it. It was a dynamic region built on extensive networks of mobility, settlement, trade. It was deeply connected to places like Gujarat, Oman, Yemen. It was a crossroads, not a void.
What other kinds of sources support this idea of a vibrant, interconnected Sind, challenging that empty space notion?
Oh, there are quite a few mentioned. For example, there's the Samdisarasaka. It's a Prakrit poem from the 12th century, so just before the Chachnama, written by Abdur Rahman.
And what does it describe?
It gives this beautiful, rich description of the cultural life in Multan line, talks about songs, people studying Vedas, epics being recited, public performances, and it also maps out this mercantile geography, showing trade routes and forts connecting Multan down to Cambay and Gujarat. It paints a picture of a world brimming with diverse people, stories, economic activity, definitely not empty.
That sounds vivid. What about earlier sources?
Well, Arab geographers writing centuries earlier, we're talking 9th, 10th centuries, figures like Ibn Qurdawi, Masudi, Istakri, Ibn Hakal. Their works consistently describe interconnected city-states in Sind, bustling trade routes. They mentioned established Muslim communities living there long after the initial conquest.
And interacting with local rulers.
Yes, they even describe interactions and alliances between Muslim travelers or settled communities and local Indic rulers. They mention a figure they call the Bahara, a powerful Indic king described as a friend to Muslims who allowed them to build mosques and practice their religion freely in his lands.
So, evidence of coexistence and interactions centuries before the Chachnama was written.
Absolutely. And there's even a fantastic anecdote cited from the same century as the Chachnama, the 13th century. It comes from Muhammad Afi, whom we mentioned earlier.
What's the story?
In his collection of stories, the Jawami Hikayat, Afi tells about Muslims living peacefully in Cambay, Gujarat, under a Hindu ruler named Jai Singh. At one point, a mosque is attacked by some non-Muslims. Jai Singh personally investigates, finds the perpetrators, ensures justice is done, and even provides funds to help rebuild the mosque.
Wow, that's a powerful illustration from a contemporary source.
Isn't it? It's a direct example of dialogue, justice, and coexistence across religious lines, right from the world Ali Kufi was writing in. And you have other 13th century figures too, like the Persian geographer Zakaria ibn Muhammad Qazwini, who praised the richness, the trade goods, the vibrant cities of Sind.
So, taken together, all these sources, the poem, the geographers, Offie's anecdote, Qazwini, they really dismantled that colonial idea of Sind as some desolate landscape defined only by an 8th century conquest and subsequent emptiness.
Completely. They paint a picture of a complex, multi-layered society, a place where different communities interacted, traded, sometimes fought, yes, but also coexisted and built shared lives over centuries. That is the vibrant, complex world that provided the backdrop, the source argues, for the Chachnama's sophisticated engagement with questions of how to govern such a diverse place.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together then. By moving past those traditional, maybe limiting labels of translation and conquest narrative, what does the source ultimately argue the Chachnam is? What is its true nature?
It's presented, quite compellingly, I think, as what the source calls an Indic political theory.
Indic political theory.
Yeah.
Okay, break that down a bit.
Well, its core message, its central concern, isn't really about detailing military events of the past. It's about how a political community, with its capitals, its forts, its trade networks, its places of worship, how such a thing should be formed, and crucially, how it should be maintained.
And it sees this formation as a complex process.
Very much so. It portrays the creation of this polity as a series of political acts involving multiple agents. Muslim figures like Muhammad bin Qasim, yes, but also Brahmin figures like Chach and his advisors. And maybe the most crucial part of this Indic political theory is the argument that a legitimate, stable polity should emerge, not just from sheer force or conquest,
But from?
but from negotiation and dialogue, from recognizing limits, from incorporating existing traditions.
And you stressed before it's deeply rooted in its local, its Indic context.
Fundamentally, the source emphasizes that the text is deeply embedded in its Indic environment. It draws intellectual and cultural ideas from that context. For instance, it often interprets actions, rituals, or foreign ideas, not just through a purely Islamic theological lens, but through the practical lens of good governance, justice, statecraft concepts that had long traditions within Indic thought as well.
This really resonates with something the historian Peter Hardy suggested, quite tentatively, years ago, doesn't it? He wondered if the Chachnama might contain lessons for the Muslim rulers of its own day, the 13th century, and if it represented a kind of domestication of these new rulers into the Indian subcontinent's environment.
Yes, absolutely. The source explicitly connects its interpretation back to that earlier, very perceptive insight from Hardy. It argues that, yes, the Chachnama is providing genuine advice for rulers contemporary to Kufi. It is trying to establish a moral genealogy, a basis for their authority that's rooted in more than just conquest.
And it makes a case for understanding difference.
Strong case, especially religious difference. It argues for navigating that difference through negotiation and established principles of justice. Ultimately, the source suggests the Chachnama reflects the long, messy, interconnected history of lives lived together in the region, and it tries to offer a political ethic suitable for that reality.
Wow. This has been, well, a truly profound rereading of a text many might think they know. It really changes the picture.
It certainly does. We've journeyed quite far from seeing the Chachnama as primarily just an 8th century history of conquest.
To seeing it instead as this rich, sophisticated work of political theory born out of the complex, turbulent, interconnected world of 13th century Sind.
That's the shift in perspective the source urges.
And the value here feels tremendous. I mean, this text, viewed this way, it's far from being just a chronicle of battles. It seems to offer these really deep insights into ethical governance, the crucial importance of limits to power, and maybe most relevantly, how to navigate difference within a diverse society.
Lessons drawn from a specific time and place, absolutely. But as you say, they feel remarkably resonant, don't they?
They really do. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to take away and reflect on. Consider how looking at historical texts, maybe texts you thought you knew, not just for what happened, but for the ideas they were trying to convey, ideas about power, about justice, about community, how that kind of reading might offer you blueprints or perhaps cautionary tales relevant to the challenges you face in navigating our own complex world today.